Hello my friends, I'm Jim, and if you're new here, thanks for stopping by. Today I'm doing a lens review on the Viltrox 50mm f1.8 FE lens, which is this little thing. It's fantastic. I really like it. It's a solid build. It feels great in the hand because it is metal construction. It also looks great on my Sony camera, and that 50mm focal length is ideal for a couple of things I'm going to talk about and show you some example pictures. And that f1.8 bright aperture is fantastic for low light, which comes in really handy for the kind of things I would like to shoot with this lens. And of course, the example photos that I've shot as well take advantage of that bright aperture. Now, first I want to thank the nice folks at Viltrox for sending me this lens to review. They previously sent me their 24mm and 35mm lenses, both of which I love, and they're both f1.8 just like this one. And interestingly, all three of these are basically almost exactly the same size. This one sells for approximately $359. I'll put a link down below if you'd like to get more information. But overall, I'm very pleased with my use of it so far, but there are a couple of things to be aware of just in case. And this is also a good time to point out that the folks at Viltrox, while they did send me this lens, they didn't ask me to speak about anything in particular. In other words, this review is completely based on my own experiences and the things that I've noticed while using this lens. So thanks again to the Viltrox folks. Now, 50mm is I think a useful and fairly versatile focal length, even though it is a prime lens, of course. But for me, it's perfect for portraits. I've shot portraits with a few different lenses over time, primarily 50mm, but also 75 and 85mm lenses. And I gotta say, I don't really use those longer focal lengths anymore, 75 or 85. And in fact, I sold the 85mm lens that I had bought for portrait photos because I prefer the 50mm length. It just suits my style of portrait better. And so this lens in particular, I went and shot an event, and I'll show you some footage from that, or some photos, I guess I should say. Bottom line, they came out really great, and I love that f1.8 in lower light. Now, also, I like to use 50mm for street photography and walking around, kind of a cityscape kind of shot, but not, of course, the big broad cityscapes because it's 50mm, tighter focal length, and therefore tighter field of view, but I think it's worked really well for me in that regard as well. First, let's take a close-up look at this lens. Okay, and a little closer look at the lens. Like I said, nice metal construction, 55mm filter thread, not heavy but solidly built. The focusing ring is nice and smooth, allowing you to get a nice crisp focus in your image. And there's also an aperture ring that is clickable into the A position, allowing you to adjust aperture in camera, or if you exit the A position, you can move it around to adjust the aperture on the lens. On the inside, you can see there is no weather sealing. However, there is a USB-C port for firmware updates in the future. All around, really solid piece of equipment. Okay, now we're going to pop into Lightroom and take a look at a few photos, a few portraits from that portrait event that I mentioned, as well as a few city street shots. This first portrait, as you can see here in Lightroom, f2.0, ISO 200, had some nice warm light coming in, but you can see, I mean, nice and crisp, beautiful focus on his eye. There is, of course, a thinner plane of focus when you're at these wide open apertures like f2 and especially f1.8. You can see how the focus falls off, but I feel like the background is nice and smooth and almost really dreamy looking. So I think that looks fantastic. In this portrait, slightly bumped ISO to 320, and this one is at f1.8, was focused on her right eye. And once again, you can see nice kind of fall off in terms of the focus and the smooth, kind of creamy or almost dreamy kind of background. Now, in this case, I want to show you the eyes. I mean, I think the eyes are just fantastic here. Super crisp, super focused, also f1.8, ISO 320, but slightly increased exposure comp, therefore a brighter overall photo. But you can see a nice focus fall off as it gets kind of smoother into the background. Now here's one a little bit lower light, again, f1.8, ISO 500. You can see nice crisp focus, both eyes, and again, nice soft fall off. This was a little bit later that evening, and of course it was dark outside, had a side light coming in across her face, of course. But I think overall that portrait looks great as well. Now here it is, same person, slightly later as it entered blue hour. ISO has now been bumped to 800 and it's f1.8. And again, solid focus on the eye, but this is where I started to see it felt like the lens was hunting for focus a little bit in these lower light situations. So something to be aware of. I felt like on the 24 and 35 millimeter Viltrox, I didn't have that issue at all, but I did find that on this 50. And so some of the times when these models, they would pose and then they'd kind of move and pose again. I had a couple of times I had to ask them to just to pause so that I could get the shot because it was hunting for focus slightly. So something to be aware of, but again, once I got focus, it was totally fine. It locked on and it was solid. And I think ISO 800, f1.8 in lower light, I think it looks nice. And here you can see a nice kind of soft background blur. And the last portrait, this was even later that evening. This is, again, f1.8, but ISO is bumped up to 2500. But if you take a look at his face, I mean, it looks nice and crisp. Great focus on the eye. Overall, I think really solid look to the image. I love shooting in that lower light with that f1.8. And of course, bumping up that ISO is what you have to do. But even so, even with a little bit of noise in the photo, easy enough to take out. But I really think I got great focus on his eye there. And I think that portrait came out great. Now, I want to take a look at a few city shots. So this is just a random kind of shot, basically, in a street near my house where I was out wandering at sunset. And what I wanted to do is get some shots in basically good light and then some in lesser light. So again, f1.8, ISO 500, kind of straight down the middle. But you'll see it looks nice and crisp and sharp. And then, of course, the sort of background area is slightly blurred and kind of softer. Now, one thing to think about, and that is on the 24 and the 35 Viltrox, I felt like when I was at f1.8, I was getting a bit of vignetting on the lenses, and of course the corners were kind of soft. I would expect that at f1.8 for the corners to be soft. I don't always necessarily expect vignetting, but in this lens, I don't see the vignetting. Honestly, I don't notice it. I mean, if you look at this corner, there's no vignetting whatsoever. I just don't really see it at all. So I did not notice vignetting here like I did in the 24 or 35, but even if you do encounter that, it's easy enough to fix in post. Now here's a shot, ISO 500, obviously f1.8, straight down the middle, just focused on this sign, but you can see nice kind of soft blur to the background, but yet the entire center of the photo is nice and crisp, and including the sign down below. So I think that looks great, and did not have any problems hunting for focus here. Now, it got a little bit later as I walked around. I went by this Sonic, and here it is, f1.8, again, ISO 500, but that looks fantastic. By the way, all of these photos are completely unedited. I should probably say that up front. So no edits to any of these photos. These are the raw files straight out of camera. But I think that sign looks great, which was obviously my focal point, but at f1.8, and then I got a nice dramatic sky that this sunset kind of went off, which I was kind of excited about, to be honest. As it got a little bit darker, ISO 500 again, f1.8, straight down the middle in terms of my focal point. But I mean, this tattoo sign, this open sign on the window, the door, things like that, those look pretty solid considering I'm in pretty low light. And also, by the way, I should point out, every single photo here is handheld. One of the things I like about prime lenses is those bright apertures, and at f1.8 and in lower light with a bumped up ISO, I don't need to bring a tripod, which I like quite a bit. And once again, I would say, the corners, yeah, sure. I mean, at f1.8 and lower light, I don't expect to have sharp corners. I don't really care, to be honest. I do care about vignetting, but I don't even see that here. And so I think this looks honestly just fine. And to be clear, did not have any issues focusing here or hunting for focus in this lower light. And then even here, as it got even darker past sunset, kind of getting into blue hour, once again, f1.8 here, ISO 800, but this is kind of a little bit of a broader scene of a coffee shop, but shot straight down the middle. I think the focus looks fine. Everything looks nice and sharp and crisp. I don't see anything issue-wise with the corners in terms of vignetting. You would notice that in that sky because it's blue. I see a lot of birds that were flying around and probably a couple of spots. But overall, I mean, I think the image quality looks great. The only challenge I had was hunting for focus a little bit, but it was primarily with the portraits, in other words, moving subjects. So that was a little bit of a challenge, I feel like, but on the street shots, I didn't have any of those issues. Now this lens does take advantage of the image stabilization in the Sony camera because there is not any of that built into the camera. And as I mentioned earlier, there is no weather sealing either. But overall, I mean, the lenses perform fine with the exception of lower light portraits, which is kind of like a slightly moving subject. I felt like it hunted for focus a little bit. But overall, I'm happy with the way the lens is performed. I want to thank Viltrox for sending me this lens to evaluate. I can definitely see myself using this one, especially in street shots and some of my portrait work as well when I go to these events, because the results are fantastic and I'm quite happy with the photos that I've captured with this 50mm f1.8. So thanks again to the Viltrox team. Thank you for watching. Hope this gives you some idea about the lens. I've got a link down below if you want to check it out. And if you enjoyed this video, that playlist has some more gear reviews that you might enjoy as well. Thank you, my friends. I will see you next time. And until then, take care and adios.